Hello, and welcome to the fourth attempt at recording this. And I'm going to go for, well, welcome to the governments of Washington Treaty War, their priorities. I'm going to go for the form of analysis where we are going, kind of like I do with ship designs. I'm going to look at what the stated objectives are and what the contents of the design show us with the real emphasis points to the objectives. In this case, the contents are, of course, who have you sent? Have you sent an admiral who is your naval secretary, and despite the cultural history and the historical idea of the Japanese feeling completely wronged by the treaty system, when he goes back, he's considered to have done such a good job, he actually ends up becoming Prime Minister. Admittedly, I think he is another one who gets assassinated, but there again, if you're a Prime Minister in Japan in the 20s and 30s and you get assassinated, it just means you've done a good job. And at least one of the umpteen factions don't like you because of it. But no, they all have their own little quirks. The Americans market themselves all as citizens of the United States, which is, you can see why they do that. I know there are some historians who call it a conceit and some historians who call it various things, and there are certain various nations at the time who interpret it kind of going, oh really? But it's a nice thing to say, we're all citizens of the United States, but the reality of course is your average citizen cannot sign a country up to a treaty. They just can't. Basically, it's the Americans making a point in every treaty that we don't have knighthoods or titles like that. And everyone else here does, so we are different. If you want to, that's fine, but it's also a bit of a case of, yeah, it's your domestic grandstanding. It works for your domestic populace, but it's not because you don't have the titles. You do have the titles. If you consider some of the titles and what they phrase about their ambassadors, etc., there are the titles there. So, how does this help us if we do this sort of analysis? Well, the example I would use is the Dutch battleship from 1913-14, the Dutch designs. And you get these stated targets and capabilities required by the Dutch, which they put out to tender, and German and British yards apply. And then you look at the designs. And so above it you have, all these ones are theoretically to the same stated goal, but a different emphasis of how they achieve that goal, and the emphasis on secondary missions and capabilities which come up, really change the designs and make them different. However, how does this interact with a treaty? Well, it's kind of an interesting mix. You see, who you send as a signatory means who you are sending, who is going to be leading discussions. Seems strange. There's going to be a whole slew of delegates sent. Each group is going to send a whole team. Why do the signatories have more influence, the signatory delegates have more influence than any other delegate there? Well, barring perhaps one of the Japanese ones, who's an extra gentleman we'll be discussing, signatory delegates are the people who actually have to put their names to paper. And so if they don't want to sign something, it becomes very, very interesting. And whilst, yes, they're signing on behalf of their government, they're also the leading voices of their government there, and they will be reporting back to their government. So if they say they don't consider it's a good thing to sign, there's a big problem. Whereas if one of the other delegates who's not a signatory delegate doesn't like it, well, to be honest, you can, to an extent, ignore them. So consider the signatory delegates to be like the directors in a company. They actually have influence. There are people who are below them, who are managers and associates and all sorts of things, who are supporting them. and they will all feed into a discussion. But if the directors don't sign off on it, it isn't happening. Everyone in the room has a voice, but not everyone in the room has a signature. And this has an impact on what you are seeing in a conference and how it develops. Their emphasis, their experience, their knowledge, their understanding, all these things have an impact. And they have a value. James book plug. It's the fact that the second edition is available to be pre-ordered. The fact that it's got some interesting little bits in it. The fact that some people say they are going to be buying it even though they have the first edition as well, just makes me very, very happy. Thank you, everyone. I hope it's out soon. I think it should be. Anyway, so here we go. And this is what I mean. This is the actual framing as comes from the text. The President of the United States of America represented by citizens of the United States. They're not citizens. They are citizens chosen by citizens, but they're not just citizens. You've got your Secretary of State there, Charles Evan Hughes, arguably the most powerful man in government. You talk about him in a second. You've got Henry Cabot Lodge. Not exactly lacking in power himself. He is the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the Senate Majority Leader. You've got Oscar Underwood, who is the Senate Minority Leader. And you've got Ilya Root, who is a really interesting person to have there, considering he's no longer anything, theoretically, but he is a major, major advocate of peace and disarmament. And all three of them are spending hawks. Then we've got the United Kingdom. The Right Honourable Arthur James Balfour. Former Prime Minister, Lord President of the Privy Council, noted peer of the realm, and all around very, very integrated into the entire British system. Baron Lee of Fareham, First Lord of the Admiralty, and the person who would donate checkers to the Prime Minister forever. And the Right Honourable Sir Auckland Campbell Geeds, the Ambassador of the United States, and the closest of any of those three to someone who actually believes in cutting defence. But the thing is, all three are representatives of a government which is led by someone who does believe in the idea that if you want to make peace and make peace happen, what you have to do is to make everyone disarm. Which is a nice idea, as long as you can, of course, make everyone disarm. If you can't, then it's a problem. We'll get into that. From Canada comes the former Prime Minister, Sir Robert Laird Borden. From Australia comes the Right Honourable George Foster Pearce. Very, very connected. Minister for Home and Territories, former Minister of Defence. A representative of a solid government with a solid plan for preferably a stronger navy. That's what Australia wants. Dominion New Zealand, the Honourable Sir John William Salmond. He is a justice, he is a judge, he is a very learned and legal officer. He also understands that, frankly, whilst New Zealand needs a strong Royal Navy to protect it, they can't afford to pay much for a strong Royal Navy, and they can't afford to provide many crew. This was the same problem they had with HMS New Zealand, and why HMS New Zealand is HMS New Zealand, not HMZS or HMNZS New Zealand. From South Africa, well, the Prime Minister of South Africa looks around and decides that, frankly, the most prestigious and capable speaker he can send on his behalf is his British friend Arthur James Balfour, who's already going as the head of the British delegation. So that makes life easy. Then for India, the Right Honourable Valingman Sankaranyarana Srivinsa Sastry. Sorry about the second name. I am terrible at pronouncing. I've had Google Translate. I have had a friend who is actually, it's a terrible one to say, friend. Someone who I've known for about 30 odd years, who I have played table tennis and all sorts of random things over the years with, and happens to own the local corner shop. I have tried to work it out with him, and he has just looked at me and gone, why can you not get his name? I cannot. I'm sorry. So, apologies to my friend, apologies to everyone. I cannot get that second name right. It just twists my tongue up. I do apologise. But what's worse is that we're talking possibly about one of the most learned and capable speakers ever sent around the world. One of the best people at using the English language. If you were ever lucky enough to be able to read his prose or listen to some of his recorded speeches, you will hear a true master of the English language at work. India couldn't have sent a stronger, more capable representative. The President of the French Republic sent Mr. Albert Sarraute, Deputy Minister of Colonies, and pretty much considered a bit of a and Jules J. Jusserad, Ambassador Extraordinaire, who is more connected, more intelligent, and probably a lot more viable than the minister, but he's technically the second signatory, so he has less influence in the decisions. King of Italy, well, he sent the Honourable Carlo Strashnal, Senator of the Kingdom, the Honourable Vittorio Rolando Ricci, Senator of the Kingdom and Ambassador to Washington, the Honourable Luigi Albertini, Senator of the Kingdom. They have a mission, a very clear mission: do not accept less than France. Which immediately is going to cause France trouble, but France hasn't worked that out, and France doesn't have the same leadership that Italy does. Italy, despite being in various issues at this point, and despite, at the end of this period, there being the rise of Mussolini, does actually have some very clear and sensible leaders who have worked out that if they have parity with the French, then they rule, because the French have more commitments than the Italians do. The Italians can focus on the Mediterranean, the French can't. And Japan, well, Baron Tomosaku, if I can get it pronounced right, Baron Tomasaburo Kato, Minister for the Navy, Baron Kinjiro Shirera, Ambassador, and Mr. Masano Hanehara, Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs. Plus, and please note this, there is also an extra one there who is probably even more powerful than all those three combined. Sent arguably because the Prime Minister of Japan worried that he was too militant, even though he was happy to an extent with what he got, and wanted extra assurance of what was going on. So this is the government of President Warren G. Harding. Harding, sadly, is not long for this world. He is not possibly the greatest president in United States history, but he's not a bad man. Often people start to point to this gentleman over here, who's the Secretary of the Treasury, as being the most powerful man in the government, and he is, of course, Mellon, Secretary of the Treasury Mellon. he's not actually as powerful as he goes on to become. He becomes very powerful in the next presidency, and as time goes on. In fact, his power probably peaks in about late 1928, early 1929, and then of course the Wall Street crash and various things happen, and his power as Secretary of Treasury goes away. But this is his first turn, and he'd been brought into cabinet by this man, who is Charles Evan Hughes, who's positioned here quite simply because these are the two big names at this table. They are the two powerful people. And whilst he has won the election and is president, it's this man who's brought together his government and his cabinet. So this is the man he's sending to represent him. What does he want? Well, what does Harding want? What do they all want? They want to have a strength for America. They want America to be powerful in the world, to be recognized for its new position, its new status. They also don't want to spend any money. Look, there was someone, who was it? I think he's dead now, actually. Sadly enough, he wasn't that old. When I say not that old, I think it was in his late 50s, early 60s. But there was an American historian, and I'm trying to remember his surname, but he came to a conference in the UK and he was chatting away. And his statement on the Washington Naval Treaty stuck with me. He said they were trying to achieve by treaty what Congress would never pay for. With the death of Tillman, with Wilson, I think I described him as actually dead, but as I was reminded by someone, he's just politically dead at this point. He's basically, he's so worn out, his body's so broken that it's just, he's not doing anything. And with the loss of Roosevelt, with the loss of all these people who had been campaigning for a strong navy, the steam and power behind building a stronger navy had really gone away. And actually, all they had keeping their current production going was the tech race with Britain. And they could, it was cutting it. All that would take would be a nice agreement with Britain, or Congress just deciding, frankly, that we're never going to fight Britain. What's the point? We get along, we talk too well with each other. We're not going to have a war. In which case, they'd have just stopped. Or, alternatively, Japan. You know, that's that. Japan's far more. Japan is to an extent the heat in the race. It's one of the interesting things about the whole period we're talking about. When people start talking about there being a potential Anglo-UK naval race, no, it's just like there wasn't an Anglo-US naval race. There wasn't an Anglo-US naval race really in the 1910s and 1900s. There was a tech race. There was a qualitative race going on, and Italy and Japan were part of that, with Britain and America, and Germany really wasn't as part of that as they were, as people sometimes. Well, Germany just really wasn't part of it. Some people say they were, but they're not really, because Germany's putting so much emphasis, especially through their laws, etc., the way they structure naval improvement, in getting as many ships as they can, so they can challenge Britain to a quantitative race, or rather the risk fleet strategy, as I'll be getting into next week. In risk fleet and turbines and its effects on technology. On the, I think that'll be on the 7th or 8th of August. That will come out, 2023. Yes, 8th of August. So, because of that, because they've got all that going on, they're not really pushing the technology as hard as other navies are. And so Britain's in a tech race with others, but that's because Britain needs to be in a tech race, because a tech race is about its own industrial capabilities and its ability to market and sell ships abroad. So that's why you're in a tech race. America post World War I finds itself in a bit of a race, and people then start thinking, oh, is it against Britain? It's not. It's almost risk fleet strategy again, Japan versus the United States. This time, with Japan taking on the role of Germany. America can outproduce Japan with its eyes closed. At any point. But the Japanese are pushing for it because of their position. So the thing is, for the Americans, if they can find a way to limit Japanese construction, then they're saving themselves a lot of money. And if they by that also manage to get themselves parity with Britain in terms of global status, then America has arrived. It's a signal that the process, which has been probably started a while back, but people did know was coming, that the global Anglo dominance is being, the torch of it is being passed. No, it didn't pass at this point. It isn't. It's not the Washington Naval Treaty which hands that over. No, it's post end of World War II that sort of really hands that one over. It gets a bit muddy during World War II, but let's put it this way: the world is a complicated place, and trying to work out sometimes which one is which is a mess. But no, these are the 4 gentlemen sent to represent the United States as their signatory powers. And their aim is to achieve what they can, so that these two, the Senate Majority Leader, the Senate Minority Leader, can go back to the Senate and tell them to approve the treaty. Basically, the good thing of sending those two to be part of negotiations is that you have pretty much guaranteed that the treaty will pass through the Senate and will be agreed. You've got Hughes to argue the government's case. You've got Root to provide political cover for the rest of their, the wider movement of why we're doing this, because we're giving peace a chance, not because we don't want to spend money. It's no. We'd spend the money if we had to, of course we would. No, it's because we want to give peace a chance by disarming. And you've got Lodge, Underwood, to make sure it gets through the Senate. I will say, and this is just a personal thing, but why is it that all the people without moustaches and beards look, even though they seem to be pulling the same facial expressions, look grumpy? I mean, literally. These the ones with moustaches and beards look like they're smiling. This one, he looks like he's sitting something uncomfortable, and then, well, Harding here looks like he's about to bore the cameraman's face off with his own laser eyes. And Secretary Mellon is literally looking at Harding going, why do you have me sitting here for a photograph? Why? Why, man? It's just, it's an aside, but it's worthwhile thinking about. So the UK government, well, this is an interesting thing because of course it has David Lloyd George, the Welsh wizard, at its head. And it's a coalition government still, and they have all sorts of lovely ideas about the world, but one of the biggest things you have coming through a lot in terms of Lloyd George is the horror at World War I, the horror at the losses, the horror at this massive continental war which has sapped so much blood and treasure, and a desire to avoid them. And this is where you start to get a real problem in terms of human psychology, because there's a lovely idea that some people have, especially people who've grown up and they've always been strong. So you think, as you talk about the people involved in this, they've always been strong. They've always been representatives of a strong nation, secure in its place in the world. They've always a nation which has never really been threatened. Even during the Anglo-German naval race, Britain was never really threatened. And no, if they'd stopped building ships, then they would have been in trouble. But because of their industry and infrastructure, they were able to keep building ships at a sufficient rate that they were never really threatened. And it's only if you have the ego of never having really been frightened, of never really being scared, do you think the idea that if the world, if everyone just disarms, if everyone just takes off all their weapons, everything will be peaceful. The question always is, will you get everyone to disarm? The Soviet Union's not going to disarm. Dictatorships don't tend to disarm or follow the rules. And there's all sorts of other fun things. And there's a lot more countries in the world than are just signing this treaty. And you have to defend a global empire, which, to an extent, is held together by force. Yes, the British are very good at giving people the options of plabo or plebo, silver or lead. And a lot of the time, or carrot and stick, if you want to go that phrase, a lot of the time the people take the silver. Let's be honest, the British managed to... One of the reasons why they managed to rule India for as long as they did was by bribing Maharajas. They literally paid for them to have an exquisite lifestyle because it was cheaper than fighting them to pay them. It really was. But you also need the force. Now, agreeing to a treaty, even if you fundamentally believe that no matter what treaty you agree to, even if you agree to parity with the United States, that their Congress will never fund it. That their Congress will never fund up to it. And also, if the Washington Naval Treaty is a good example of this, the fact that the whole cruiser scenario is left undefined, so as many cruisers can be built as possible, is of course as part of the British plan, because the idea was to return to one of the pre-World War I plans where all the major dominions, hence they're there as signatories, will have their own cruiser squadrons. Squadrons which can be used to deal with surface raiders. And probably their own destroyers and maybe even some submarines. That was certainly in the British plan. The Dominions would have to pay for their own ships, but they would do it, wouldn't they? The plan does fall apart because the Dominions don't want to, but we'll get into that one. Well, one Dominion does. One Dominion does build its own fleet. That's, of course, Australia. But the others don't. The whole thing, though, the whole British gamble, does come back to Lloyd George's idea, which Geeds buys into and of course his brother buys into, but which I would argue Balfour doesn't buy into, that the world can be made peaceful by telling everyone to be disarmed. You see, it works, but it only works as long as there's a policeman. Let me explain that. If you have a set of laws that everyone has to follow, and an impartial force to enforce them, and you have a strong enough national culture and history of it to counterbalance, so anyone tries to use that group, which are allowed to use force within the society, to take over, will find that that force will not follow the orders and will not take over. This is one of the reasons why I prefer having human soldiers than robot soldiers. Well, it can work. It can work being and people not having weapons. It can work. There's still going to be violence. There's going to be physical violence, but there's no weapons as much. And so you've reduced the level of threat. But that's within a country, within a playground, within a very controlled scenario. When you're talking international relations, who is going to enforce on these countries they follow these rules? Who? Are America and Britain going to declare war on Italy because they find out that their cruisers are 1,000 tons heavier than they're supposed to be? Let's put it another way. Are they going to turn around to their population to to the mothers, wives, fathers, daughters, and tell them their sons and fathers have to go off to war to fight because the Italians built their ships 1,000 tons heavier than they were supposed to. That some of them could die. That they're gonna have to spend treasure, lives, tax money, all those things because of that. Because if they're not, then this document doesn't work. It's entirely based on you enforcing it on your own self-interest. And that's the first problem with any document like this, because it means that you have to be very careful when structuring it. And this is a problem with some of the representations going on. So that it's in everyone's self-interest to follow it. For Britain, their self-interest is based on they want to build 2 new battleships because most of theirs are pre-World War I era, which means they're older than some of the others who've been building during World War I. And they want to be able to build as many cruisers as they need in order to defend the empire. That is their criteria, and that is what they walk in for and what they walk away with. When anyone says we want to place limits on numbers of cruisers, the British go, well, we'll be going then. That's why the Washington Treaty, there are no limits on cruiser numbers. There are limits on the cruiser size. Lord help us, the Hawkins class became the model for that one. But there are no limits on total numbers. So you're allowed to have a huge number of cruisers. And again, what does it show us when you send a former Prime Minister who's deeply connected? Well, that's going to keep everyone on side. With Britain again, there's a First Lord of the Admiralty. So the person who is responsible for getting the Admiralty their budget in Parliament is there. And the ambassador, to act as eminence grise and make sure that they know who are important within the American factions for them to talk to, how they talk to them, how they discuss with them. And as said, he's probably also the closest to David Lloyd George's personal representative at the conference, and probably the one pushing from the British side the idea of peace the most, and give peace a chance and let's all disarm. From Canada, we have Prime Minister Sir Robert Borden, who had been Prime Minister 1911 to 1920. And he's sent by William Mackenzie King. Now, here is the thing. Canada is happy to pay towards the defence of empire, but they don't want to actually supply ships, they don't want to actually supply people if they can avoid it, especially in peacetime. Interesting conversion to think about here, though, is if you have more force in peacetime to act as a deterrent, the likelihood of war becomes arguably less, because people and nations understand what is in front of them. Because there's one thing saying, well, on paper, the Canadians can produce this. Well, on paper, they have that. That on paper isn't scary. As a deterrent. They have 3 Queen Elizabeth class battleships. Holy sugar! Well, yeah, we've got to think about that. Because if you add that into the British strength and have that going around, then that's 3 more 15-inch gun battleships wandering around, and you have an extra 3 in World War II. Think about what happens there, but also think about what an extra 3 of Queen Elizabeth class in World War I does. Now, you can turn around and go, well, surely under the treaty system they might have been forced to give them up. The problem under the treaty system is that only Australia has them. So Australia is the only one trying to fight to maintain their right to having a capital ship. They want to keep their capital ship. They would prefer to have a better one. They've got their eyes on some lovely British battlecruisers which are just about to be got rid of. But you know, they'd like to keep having a battlecruiser. But the trouble is, New Zealand can't afford them. India doesn't really want them because they would like to build up a cruiser squadron, but they know they can't jump straight into operating a large capital ship, and they're going to be too dependent upon Britain if they do. South Africa likes to believe it's a long way from everywhere and doesn't need to do anything. And Canada, well, their major worry is the person to their south, their southern border, and they don't feel they need a fleet for that fight, because if they do end up in that fight, the British will have to come and help them. And frankly, they can save money this way. They even avoid the cruisers in the peacetime. We can all think about how the fate of the Canadian Navy could be a lot better, very different, if they had built up a cruiser squadron from 1911 onwards. So, Robert Laird Borden is there to ensure that Canada is well protected by the Royal Navy, but are in a scenario where they can contribute money, where they can contribute aid in terms of supplies, but they don't have to do anything else. They want to do the bare minimum. They want to pay the fees for the club, i.e. the British Empire they're a part of. They consider it still very useful at this point, but they don't want to pay the dues, i.e. taking their turn as wardens on the wall. Or if you prefer me to use another book as an allegory, then they don't want to be part of the Grey Watch. Australia. Well, I said in the live about my personal reservations about William Morris Hughes. So I have very little faith personally in his word, but I know what he's after. He's after the best deal he can for Australia. And for Australia, he wants a stronger navy. Same with Sir George Foster Pearce. They would ideally love to keep hold of their capital ship. They would like to keep having their flagship. It's a glorious thing for them to have. It puts them in a club, and this is one of the things which is often forgotten about these ships. That people go, oh, they're so expensive, they couldn't afford them, they're this, they're that. No, they're really not, because three things. One, there's a lot more yards that can build them, which means there's a lot of competition, which keeps costs down at this time. Not like today, where there's literally one yard in the UK which can build our aircraft carriers, one yard in the United States which can build their carriers, and as they're private companies, they are going to charge a profit, and they're pretty much a monopoly. They are the definition of a monopoly. It's at certain points in that where you get me, who is, as I admitted before, has been a Conservative borough councillor in the UK, is a weird Conservative, because I believe in not using ideology to make decisions, actually just looking at the facts and going off the facts, and these days for modern conservatism that seems to be weird, but my argument at that point would be, if you are literally single source supplying something of the level of importance as an aircraft carrier, etc., that's where I would like the idea of navy yards, royal dockyards to return, and have a royal, rather than having a de facto royal dockyard which is run as a private company and you're having to pay the profit margin for, just have a royal dockyard. It's amazing how much cheaper the ships might get if you can delete the costs of the profit margins. Although, there again, if you have a royal dockyard, that means you're going to have to use it and keep construction going for it, because otherwise you're going to be paying people to do nothing. And that's the reason why they prefer to have it as private companies. But leaving that all to one side, this is why in this period, what we're talking about is actually a lot cheaper and a lot more viable. But Australia wanted it. And Australia wanted cruisers. Why? Because for Australia, the sea is their natural border. The sea is their zone of security. Their population centres are too spread out, too distant. They can't mutually support each other. Their security depth is the sea. And their entire economic lifeblood depends on being able to move goods around the empire, around the world, around the sea. So for them, a strong Royal Navy is critical. And again, the interesting thing is, the Australians, the New Zealanders, And also, to an extent, the Canadians, even though they don't want to actually have them, are very instrumental in pushing forward the idea of no limits on cruiser numbers. No total limits. It's one of the things the Americans find strange when they're doing, some of the reports I've said on diplomacy stuff. They were expecting there to be less of a united front. They thought they could maybe, especially with Australia, they thought they could, maybe go, we've built up a good relationship during World War I. Perhaps you would like to support a side of us. And no, we need this and we need this. Especially, you see, the problem was the moment the Americans said everyone in the Commonwealth is considered under one one navy, which was a great idea for them because it meant that they didn't have to deal with the fact of the Royal Navy just passing off ships to the Dominions and going, yeah, you're balanced with us, but we've got all these Dominion fleets. It's a great idea for them, but it also meant that they tied those nations to Britain, security-wise and defence-wise. They could no longer their entire security and strength for Australia, which is this giant island, and for New Zealand, which is now dependent entirely on the Royal Navy. So they cannot afford the Royal Navy to be weak in any way, shape or form. Especially New Zealand. They can't, because for them, their entire deterrence capability, their entire security capability comes from the Royal Navy, because they don't have enough people, a large enough naval service, a large enough population, although it will grow over the next few years and will allow them to actually set up their own independent squadron. They don't have that at this point. So it's a double-edged sword for the Americans. Yes, they get to tie the Commonwealth together, but also they tied the Commonwealth together. They tied the Empire together in one navy. They actually facilitate the strengthening of naval bonds which Britain had been trying to get the Dominions into. And they do it in the name of trying to make it easier for them to be the same strength as the Royal Navy. It's one of those scenarios where you watch some of the diplomacy and discussions going on about it, and its framing of whether the Dominions would be considered independent members, and there was some ideas put forward at various points of different things for the Dominions to be, including the idea was that you would have Britain and America joint. They would have, let's say, 10 vessels. Japan, if they get their own way, gets 7 at this point, but the Americans keep pushing on to have 6. France and Italy get 4 or 3.5, as the Americans and end up being pushed down to. And then the idea was that the Dominions would get 1 or 1.5. So the idea would be Britain could have 10 cavalry ships, and New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, India could all have 1. Now, you can see from the American perspective, that's not really a good scenario. Because suddenly that means, in reality, the Royal Navies have 15 to your 10. Or if you set the limit up as, oh yeah, we're allowed 20 ships, then they're allowed, 30? Or I suppose you could say they're allowed 0.5, in which case, in terms of capital ships, they'd have 25 to your 20. Either way, it's not something you really want. You can understand the American fear and their ideas coming through on this one, and why they structure the treaties they do. But you can also understand why, the moment you deny those powers, especially Australia, their independent capability, you could have possibly Australia would have settled for it if they had been the exception, if they had been the only one given that status. That would have been a really interesting thing, because that could well have divided up the fleets a bit more. Or probably wouldn't have, but it would have meant within the Dominions that there was a first rate. There was Britain, and then there was Australia as their number one buddy within the Dominions as the other one with a capital ship. Could also lead to very interesting things as Australia chooses what to make their single capital ship, what it would be. Who knows? They might get a third Nelrod. That would have been an interesting scenario. Australian, what would they call it? Would it be called Cook? So would the class be Nelro Cook? Nelro Coup? Nelrod Coup? Could be. It's an interesting one to think about. But no, New Zealand have issues. South Africa has even more issues. South Africa has this fond belief that they are as far away from anyone as they possibly can be, and therefore they don't need to. If you actually get all the way to South Africa and come and attack South Africa, you've gone a long, long way to find a very heavily fortified area, which doesn't really have many local neighbours who are much of a problem. So why is it so fortified? Because of their own internal segregation policies. Now, Jan Christian Smuts is nothing if not a political animal. He's a halfway decent general. He's a very good politician at points. And that's one of the reasons why he picks Balfour to lead this and be his signature. Because he's basically, at this point, both ingratiating himself to Britain by saying, I trust you completely, and also saying, hands off, we're not involved. We don't have any really skin in the game because it's a naval treaty, and frankly, we don't care about naval power. Despite their position on the world, one of the consistent problems, and you can see this to this day for South Africa, is justifying a navy. They have consistent issues with it. They sit astride one of the world's most important trade routes, and when you consider what happened when the Evergreen accident occurred in the Suez Canal, they are a truly critical trade route. And yet, despite being surrounded by three of the world's largest and most powerful oceans, consistently they have looked to others to provide their naval power. When they were a Dutch colony, it was the Dutch. When the British took over, it's the British. Today, I would say their approach is let the Americans take the lead. And they might talk about other options, but they don't invest. At no point do they invest. So again, they're kind of an interesting thing in that they will provide military force for the defense of empire. Happily, they'll provide soldiers. But really, when it comes to naval strength, the example I always give to illustrate this is Protea, the one and only Flower-class corvette that South African Navy ever operated, and they didn't take her into service until after World War II. In World War II, when the world was as dependent upon escorts and movement of goods as ever was, when vital convoys were going past South Africa daily almost to serve the forces in North Africa, especially when they couldn't go through the Mediterranean, the forces in the Far East. And yet, no, they only ever had one Flower-class corvette, and that was after World War II was over. I'm not saying they didn't do their part. I'm not saying that the South African Air Force didn't fly a lot of flights of maritime patrol flights, and they didn't operate some trawlers and other vessels, but really, the Navy was never really part of their oeuvre of the war effort. And then we have India. This was a very, very cool gentleman. And a very capable gentleman who was sent to represent them. India was in a quandary. A lot of the people in India understood that they were going to need to form a nation state. That they were building up and going to become a nation state when the British left. They knew the British were going to leave. It wasn't a case of if they were going to, it's when. Because that was part of the British Dominion plan. You have to think about this. There is a reason the British do this magic trick of turning an empire into a Commonwealth and are the only major empire which ever has done that. It's because they started planning that a long time before it happened. It was a plan which had been being developed. Well, as I've said, you can trace its first roots back to Winston Churchill's father. And here's some of his discussions in the 1890s and earlier. So, that is a part of history. That is a part of the British history. The British idea of, well, we don't want to always be leading an empire. We want it to become first amongst equals. Of course, us being the first, but everyone else equally providing as they can to its defence and security and the trade, so that not everything, all the costs are being borne by Britain. Please note, I'm not saying it was done of anything, altruistic. It was self-interest, but it was enhanced self-interest, the kind of which we see sometimes in quite a lot of modern nations' actions. And so, India wants to build a fleet. A navy is a very good way of building a melting pot. Why? Well, regiments are based in places, and people can move around, and regiments can develop emphasis. And even in the Indian Army, there was not as much of a mixture in the regiments as it might have been good for there to have been. But on a ship, when you're crewing ships, that's a melting pot. And the other advantage with a navy versus an army is it tends to be a facility for those who are technically minded, for those who are skilled, to rise. It can provide an institution which can form a basis for growth in your nation. This is not mere naval history grandstanding. This is look at navies throughout history. This is what they have consistently done. They have been vehicles for taking those who are smart and able from the lower and lower middle classes and helping them rise both within the navy and within society as they rise within it. And it's a vehicle for bringing people from disparate backgrounds together. Why? Because whilst you can't really afford to stand on positions of honour and nobility in an army, and really you do need people who are smart just as much as in a navy, the sea has a habit of actively trying to kill you, as do engines. If they're not handled, if you go up and go, but I am of noble birth, they don't care. You have to be smart to be able to handle them and deal with them. So one of the reasons, the interesting example is the Austro-Hungarian Navy and the fact that their officers had to be quite so able to communicate in quite so many languages to hold their nation together. It's no wonder that a lot of Austro-Hungarian naval officers go on to very senior ranks within government and various other institutions. They're smart, they have to be, and they are linguistically able to communicate with all the vast parts of the empire. It's the same with India and building a navy. And again, for India, yes, they have the Himalayas, this wonderful mountain range for much of their northern border. But they also have two massive coastlines, and they sit in the middle of the Indian Ocean. They need naval power in order to be secure. They need naval power in order to protect their trade. They're very exposed, kind of like Australia. They need both an army and a navy, and luckily they have the infrastructure on paper, they have the industry, and they have the population to provide both. But they also need to do this within the framework of the British Empire. And that's what they wanted to do. It's actually strange in that, as a rule, the people shooting down the Indian naval forces and the growth of the Indian naval forces are not the Royal Navy. It's not the Indian members of the government themselves. Under the 1919 Government of India Act, they get their own council, their own parliament, etc. It's usually the career civil servants and governors, because they prefer to spend money on other things. It's also like there are issues with infrastructure. If you only have one railway line, a single track line going, doing vital movement of goods across the country and people, and it goes down, you're in a lot of trouble. That should be a double track line, and B, there should probably be another line. There should probably be a couple of lines going around India. That would have been sensible. But that would have been expensive investment, requiring taxes to pay for it, or loans, either to be taken out by the British government or the Indian government. And basically, unfortunately for India, is whilst they were a jewel in the crown, not everyone understood that for a jewel to retain its value, it needs to be polished. And conversely enough, for the people themselves, it would have benefited them if there had been more polishing going on. Anyway, to the French government, and for the people themselves, I mean, it's the best way to raise your quality of life is to invest in infrastructure. Infrastructure projects tend to be very expensive, but they're very useful and necessary. But they tend to be very expensive, and it's always a case of it's promising of future wealth and future growth, but you can't really predict what they're going to do, but they're still worthwhile. The French government, well, they were ones who certainly could do with investing in some infrastructure projects and some stability. You see, the French have a system whereby they can't call, under this government, they couldn't really call a new election. They had to resort the same people into a new government. So every time a government falls doesn't mean there's going to be a new election. And sometimes a minister would win an election, win the election, would be the prime minister, and then their coalition would fall apart within a couple of months, and suddenly they'd be out. And so you get the same names turning up again and again and again, but they keep coming in and changing policies, because every different coalition has a different emphasis, and every different coalition has a different balance of ministers, and so it's a nightmare. The French go to the Washington Treaty with the idea that they need to save themselves. They have suffered massive amounts of trauma in World War I. They have suffered a huge bite out of their population. They want to try and prevent wars. Now, they can't afford a naval race with Italy. They really can't at this point. Population-wise, industry-wise, and of course there's the fact that French yards have a propensity to A, take forever to complete anything, and B, if you give 4 yards the plans for one class, that you will get 8 different ships in those 4 ships built. You'll get the ships which they built and then the ships which they're refitted into. It's just, their yards do not cooperate at all. This is not to say they don't produce good ships. Their yards do produce good ships. It's just their yards constantly believe that they are smarter. Their architects believe they're smarter than the person who sent them the plans, which might be true, considering some of the designs that are sent out. But it means that instead of getting a class that you can coherently operate together as a group of ships, as the battle lines were supposed to be done, or squadrons were supposed to be done in the battle lines, you often are spending your time trying to figure out why these ships are quite so different from each other. And they're very different from each other. So, for most of this period, we have one president, Mr. Alexander Milland, who is the president September 1920 to June 1924. He's a character. He is an ardent believer in France, but is also an ardent believer in peace. efforts in trying to build peace by, again, disarming. But more importantly, whatever level France disarms to, Germany must be disarmed below that. Germany must be less. They are, him and Ponquier, who's this gentleman here, are even more than, well, I'm as good as his picture, I must have pointed to it, than, of course, Mr. Clemenceau. Even more than Clemenceau. They are focused on squeezing that German pip. Not just the oranges, frankly. Who cares about squeezing the oranges till the pips squeak? Squeeze the pips till they shatter. Now, the British were not completely opposed to this, as we often sometimes people put out. The British were quite happy with German maritime infrastructure and naval industry being squeezed till it was British shattered. And in fact, the British pretty much achieved that shattering, thank you very much, with the Treaty of Versailles, and ensured it. So the British are less bothered. But the French, World War I is fought on their soil. They lose a generation at Verdun is often the often quoted line, but it's quite true in terms of not just the physical losses of people dead or the people physically injured, but the psychological trauma that that population goes through. Verdun is a living nightmare. It makes Stalingrad look like a, I would love to say a walk in the park, and it does, but that just sounds wrong when talking about Stalingrad. But Verdun is Stalingrad on overmatch. It's just, yeah. But what this means you get is you get periods of people coming in and out of power, like Ponquier here, where they pop in, they have their policies, they try and push their policies through, and they've possibly just about got their policies implemented, and they're no longer in power. He'd been president from February 1913 to February 1920, which is an amazing run as president of France. And then he's prime minister. Again, he's prime minister before that, he's prime minister after that. He's incredibly important, and this sets a tone for a lot of French politics. But he's not actually prime minister during the negotiations. That is Aristide Briand. And Briand is even more of the let's disarm peace camp than anyone else, than the other leaders. But most importantly, he wants to try and disarm Italy. He wants to stop having a race with Italy. There is a problem here, though. France forgets they have more to protect than Italy does. Italy has formed as a nation much later than France. They've combined, it was only just, they're really a relatively new, young country even at this point. And they are also still trying to defend grow their colonies, whereas France has colonies and they're defending theirs. And France has colonies all around the world. They have colonies in the Far East, they have colonies in the Caribbean, they have colonies in Africa. This is the problem. In worrying about Italy, you worry about the Mediterranean. You can either, therefore, you end up with a fleet which is, if it's matched to Italy, it can either defend the Mediterranean or it can defend your colonial interests. It cannot defend both. In many ways, the actions taken in this conference by Sarraute and Jusserand tie France to Britain more than any of their colonies do. Any of the dominions are not as tied to Britain in many ways as France is, because France has a problem. They can not either defend their nation in Mediterranean against the Italians, or they can defend their colonies. The only way they can do both is if they slot into the Royal Navy. That's it. Because the moment they accept parity, and this gentleman, Albert Sarat, is a great example of someone who is promoted way beyond their competency. Way beyond their competency. If you look at his entire history, he manages to keep being promoted because he has great ideas on paper until you start actually questioning those ideas about, will they actually work? And this one is parity with the Italians, based on the belief the Italians won't have enough ships. The Italians will maintain the ships. And that means you can't defend your empire, which includes Vietnam, which he is in charge of at one point. Jusserand does try to point this out at several points and tries to say that they need more. But the trouble is, the moment you've accepted as a condition parity with Italy, you've lost. So it doesn't matter if France gets... if the end result is not 10... well, it's not 5, 3... 2.5. Doesn't matter what the result ends up being the moment they've accepted parity with Italy. For France, they needed either parity with Japan, in which case they could probably deter Japan and deal with Italy, or they needed Italy plus a factor. So you needed that sort of scenario of Britain, America 10, Japan 7, France 5 or 5.5, and Italy 4. But Italy wouldn't accept that, and Albert Sarraut didn't think about it. But this is why you end up with a scenario where the British, when they're considering an Eastern War, or when they're considering a war in Europe, etc., they basically just go, France, Italy, you equal each other. Any strength we add to the Mediterranean is going to allow the French to beat the Italians, because we're the overmatch force. So we're enabling their victory. If we don't, they can't win. We then need enough forces to watch the North Sea for what the Germans have, if they have anything, and then we can deploy the rest of the Far East. This is the big thing when you get the French dropping out, because the Italian Navy is a capable navy, the French Navy are a capable navy, and this is where you get all sorts of those problems in World War II. Well, suddenly the British are having to deal with the Italian Navy when they've always counted on the French dealing with them, and the French Navy is iffy as far as the British are concerned, because this is one of the gentlemen who are in the French government, who's in the Vichy government. And every time the British have dealt with him, they have basically developed the opinion of, you don't trust him. He doesn't think things through. It's one of the interesting things to think about in World War II as a legacy of these treaties and of these meetings, because so many of the key characters, the key personalities for World War II, especially some of the ones that were around in World War I, come together in these treaties, in the Washington Treaty of 1920, of the London Treaty of 1930. You have all these personalities going around, meeting each other. And that's going to feed into their assessments of what's going to take place in World War II. In Italy, you have Victor Emmanuel, who is trying to push for a growth of Italy, but also a recovery after World War I. You have Ivano Bonomi, who is the Prime Minister at this point, and is probably one of the smartest and most capable politicians that Italy has in this period. He very quickly does ascertain that parity with the French achieves everything Italy needs, because that means that France either has to sacrifice their empire to deal with them in the Mediterranean, or if they try to defend their empire, then Italy can dominate the Mediterranean, and it can make it Mare Nostrum. And Mare Nostrum is not Benito Mussolini's idea. There have lots of Italians been thinking about that for a while. The difference is in Albano Bonomi, he believes in Mare Nostrum, but he realizes that it's going to be a Royal Navy presence as well, as in the British Royal Navy. Luigi Factor is the intervening personality, and frankly, he's weak. He's weak. The Italian system is closer to the French than it is to the British. And it's one of those interesting statistics. You often hear people talk about the various pros and cons of various forms of democracy and voting systems. When you start to look into some of the issues in the 1920s and 30s of governments, first past the post can become very attractive. But that's not... the reason I say that is because some of the coalitions which get formed in order to get the amount of votes, they have no chance of ever honouring any of their electoral pledges because the parties are too disparate. Some of the factions which actually come together in France and even Italy post World War I are really, really intriguing. And they have this effect on Italy. One of the things is one of the reasons they bounce onto Mussolini is they see him as a protection against the rise of the far left. But also in Italy, he never achieves the level of power, despite his claims of being a duce and all the snazzy uniforms, etc. The fascist movement and the fascist party never achieves the same level of dominance as it does in Germany. You know how I can say that with completely confidence? This gentleman, Senator Luigi Albertini, one of the representatives sent to the Washington Naval Treaty, and a constant thorn in the side of Mussolini, constantly denouncing him and being rude about him pretty much for his entire premiership. In Parliament. Is it really a dictatorship if someone can literally be lampooning you and your speeches almost on a weekly basis in your own parliament, sometimes to your face? Is it really a dictatorship? We can ask that question. It was it was definitely an attempt at a dictatorship, but it wasn't a dictatorship as a la some of the other dictators around the world. You also have Carlo Schnazzer, who is, well, I would say he is probably the most pro-Italian Navy in this group. Both him and Albertini do support Navy. Vittorio Rolando Ricci is ambassador, the one of these groups who stays loyalist to Mussolini for longest, but he isn't really loyal to him before he comes to power. He is an interesting gentleman. I would say you have two very sharp minds there, and you have one very flexible mind. And they are out to get Italy the protection it needs. And the protection it needs is a fleet equal to that of France. Once it has that, it's secure. Doesn't need to worry about anything else. Austria-Hungary ceased to exist, really. It's now broken up into many different parts. Doesn't have any bearing for them. The Greeks, the Ottomans, they are not what they were. If you're not planning on challenging the Royal Navy for dominance in the world, the only threat to you in the Mediterranean is the French. Definitely not Spanish. And then we have the Japanese. We have Hara Takeshi, who is the Prime Minister from 29th September 1918 to the 4th of November 1921, when he is assassinated. He's the man who sends the delegation out to Washington. There is theoretically an interim government, which was theoretically going to be a real government, but soon fell because it was another non-noble who was leading it, and so Viscount Takahashi Karioko became Prime Minister on the 30th of November and would serve until the 12th of June 1922, when Admiral Tomosaboru Kato returns and he becomes Prime Minister. But we'll leave that to one side. So, what were they after? Well, the Japanese are pursuing their own risk fleet strategy here. It's very simple. They want a 7-10 ratio. That's what they want. That will make them feel secure and will keep all their factions happy. Why do they want a 7-10 ratio with Britain and the United States? It means that should Britain and the United States combine, they will stomp them. And should they actually be fighting either one solo, they will still probably lose, because the Japanese do understand their infrastructure limitations. There is a reason why they plan for a short war. A long war they know they cannot win. If they can fight a short war, they stand a chance against Britain or America. A long war, they can't win. A long war versus the Soviet Union at sea, they could probably win. A long war versus France at sea, they could probably win. A long war versus Italy, anyone else in the world, they could probably win, because they have enough infrastructure. And they're starting from a strong enough base. But a long war against either the United States or the British Empire, that's just not going to work. There's too much infrastructure on the other side. There's too much breadth on the other side. So what is their desire for a 7-10? What's the point in having a 7-10 if you know you're going to lose? So you are a very, very well-armed road bump. Speed bump, whatever you want to call it. The idea is you make yourself tough enough that not that they will lose enough strength that someone else will beat them up. The Japanese are not. This is where there's a differential from them and for their risk fleet strategy versus the German risk fleet strategy. They're not desiring that, you know, someone else will attack either America or Britain if they lose enough ships fighting the Japanese. No. They want the attack to cost Britain and America enough that they only do it if they really want to. That they won't attack and destroy Japan on a whim. That Japan, unlike China, unlike so many other countries which they have seen around the world, indigenous countries, wrecked by the pursuit of empire, will not be similarly wrecked. Or if they are going to be, it will be a very, very tough fight for anyone to do it. So that's what they want. In a funny way, they want peace. Peace through strength and security. It's funny to think that Admiral Tomosaboru Kato comes back with a 3-5, 6-10 ratio, and from the people above, the Emperor, thanks to the advice of Prince Tokugawa Ieyasu, they think he's done a good job. He's done his best. But he hasn't done enough. He has not done enough. And the trouble is, you could argue whether 7-10 would have been enough in a ratio. It probably would have been. Because it's not about persuading everyone that you have enough strength. It's about persuading enough people you have enough strength and being a win. And their fears were people trying to push them even lower than 6 or 5 to 3 ratio. Accepting a 5 to 3 ratio is almost accepting the status quo, which means they didn't lose anything, but they didn't win. And this is where you get into this big problem, because you have a fundamental misunderstanding going on between the way the Japanese speak and think about things and the way, to an extent, other powers listen to them. The British get closer, I would argue, but even the British get lost. The reason the British get closer is, to an extent, they've had a longer running relationship with the Japanese. The Anglo-Japanese Naval Treaty, the sheer quantity of engineers and people who communicated and have been working with the Japanese, that's built a different relationship than what the Americans have achieved with the Japanese at that point. And definitely different from what the French have with the Japanese, because the French are even more at sea with the Japanese than the Americans. In that the Japanese speak in a lot of illustrative imagery when they are talking about things. And this actually leads to Masana Hanehara, the only man not pictured in this group of 3 here, ending up in trouble when he's the ambassador to the United States, when he replaces Kijiro Shidera. Because there's a bill going through, and he makes a statement about it because it's going to affect Japanese immigrants to the United States. So of course he makes a statement, of course he has a position about it. He's the ambassador to the United States from Japan. And his phraseology is interpreted as a threat. It's supposed to be, he's aiming it not as a threat, he's aiming it as a way to try and put forward in a peaceful way the Japanese Japanese beliefs. And unfortunately, you do have a scenario that there were enough people in the United States who were looking for a threat from Japan at this point that they could jump on it. But there are issues here. There is also a fact that his linguistics in turning into English are not as good as others. So Japan loses, and the world loses, because if you go through it all, the only one who could say was a winner is Italy, and they don't feel a winner because they're stuck with old ships, honestly. France loses because they don't have enough now to defend their empire and themselves. Britain loses because whilst it can build as many cruisers as it wants, it's now got the problem of building ships which are going to be its fleet to go around the entire world, and it cannot reinforce the local areas it needs to enforce. It's now tied in strength, theoretically, to a 2-ocean navy, when the Royal Navy is, at minimum, if you consider the Atlantic as one ocean rather than dividing between the North and South Atlantic, the Royal Navy's got to be in the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, and the Pacific, and the Mediterranean, to protect all its interests. And probably the Arctic and the Antarctic as well. The US Navy has the Atlantic, it has the Pacific. It also has the Arctic. So the range of commitments is different. And for some of those, you do need a capital ship. You do need the capability of turning up with a capital ship in peacetime. Which causes the Royal Navy constant trouble, because what do you do with your capital ships? If you keep them concentrated, that's better for war fighting, but it's more difficult for peace fighting and deterrence. When I say peace fighting, I mean shaping conflict management and shaping conflict and deterrence. but they now have they're now limited. And for the US, they get all they want really in terms of their construction requirements, but what they were hoping to build was a constant peace. And by making everyone else feel weak, they make everyone else feel afraid. And this is going to grow with time. You can argue that it's not the fear of World War I which actually causes half the trouble in 1938, 1939 when France and Britain are trying to gear up to deter Germany. It's because they feel they need time for rearmament, and they know they need time for rearmament. Why? Because of the treaty system. If you think about it, there are treaties that affect navies. There have been no treaties affecting limiting air forces or armies. So when you're talking about a rearmament program, you're talking about rearming the navies and growing the armies and air forces. Yes, they're bringing in new technology as well. There's been the technological evolutions that are going on. But the treaties have only limited naval power. So really, you're growing the army and air force. You are rearming the navies because they have been kept at an artificially low level. Lower even than your needs have necessarily required. And as such, they don't want to get involved in a war. They want to feel strong before they can interfere. Disarmament, instead of giving the world peace, gave the world more fear. Now, I would agree that there's also problems and there's too much armament. That can also bring about fear. So it's trying to balance it and trying to get the balance right. And that's a tough thing to do in a world when you've got a lot of different characters in charge. And by characters, I don't mean personality types or anything else really. I mean dictatorships versus democracies. And the spectrum that occurs in between those two things. Because there are spectrums that occur in between those two things. Anyway, so, question. The question I'm going to ask is a very simple one, actually. Under what system do you think... Well, let's go on. So, under what system, what version of the treaties can you see Australia retaining a capital ship? What ship do you think they get to retain? And what do you think they do with it? Because I think that's an interesting one as an option if Australia had got to keep a capital ship. In the nicest way, there is no way at the strength of being limited to 15, theoretically under the treaty limit, would Britain be able to get? Would Britain give them one? So it would have to be a larger number than that. And also, do you think if they have one, do any of the other powers need one? Does Canada get one? Does India get its cruiser squadron? Because of course, the plan for the British had been to build 40 to 48 county-class cruisers, and give a number of them, a sufficient number of them. We are probably talking 18 to 23, depending on 40 to 48 to their dominions. What do you think happens? Now, thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. We have got coming up next week, of course, as I already talked about, the Dominating World, Tirpitz and the Risk Fleet, and then in the 15th of August, while I'm off doing Justin Craig stuff, it'll be building the fleets of Mobile Bay on the Tuesday. And other stuff we have coming up. We have Patron 82 and Patron 83, which will be announced on Sunday. That's the 6th of August at Brewships 120. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and take care.